Developing tonight, two men behind the firm that came up with that infamous anti-Trump dossier now say they're the real victims in this whole Russia debacle. Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch just penned an op-ed in the New York Times claiming they aren't the ones creating fake news. The Republicans are. They write, quote, today, amid a growing criminal inquiry into Russian meddling in the 2016 election, congressional Republicans are again chasing rabbits. They go on to say, we're extremely proud of our work to highlight Mr. Trump's Russia ties. To have done so is our right under the First Amendment. Here now, Bill Browder, who is no stranger to Fusion GPS. He once found himself in their crosshairs while lobbying for a piece of legislation the firm was hired to block. We thank you for being here tonight, Mr. Browder. You've read through this, obviously, and you say they left out some very important facts.
Well, the most important fact that they left out is that while they were doing the Trump dossier, they were also being paid by Russian government interests to try to overturn sanctions legislation called the Magnitsky Act, which I had been very instrumental in getting passed, which put sanctions on Russian government officials. So they were working for the Russian government interests at the same time as they were effectively trying to connect Trump with Russia, which they did not mention in this dossier, in the article they wrote in the New York Times. And it was very disingenuous for them to be saying, oh, we're such victims. And at the same time, they were out effectively trying to victimize me, Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer who was killed, and trying to overturn a piece of important human rights legislation.
And when you point out that, and the piece does talk about that, and you often talk about the Russian anti-Magnitsky narrative, you say that they also leave out another important fact, and that's that some of the journalists that were paid.
Well, this is probably the most troubling part of their whole story, which is that as they were being grilled and subpoenaed by various committees, one very important court document came out of the D.C. District Court, and it basically said, and it showed, that they were paying journalists. And so, and I know for a fact that there were a bunch of journalists who were acting inappropriately and not journalistically when they were trying to smear me and Sergei Magnitsky and repeal the Magnitsky Act. And so I'm wondering, were those journalists paid by Glenn Simpson to try to write false stories about Sergei Magnitsky? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that they were being evidence exists that they were paying journalists, and so we'd like to know the answer to that question.
Something else that Simpson complains about in this piece is Congress not releasing the transcripts. And I saw you tweeting about this today because you took issue with that because they were invited to give open testimony, you remind all of us, and they didn't show up.
Yeah. In the end of July of last year, I was invited to the Senate Judiciary Committee to give testimony about Fusion GPS and Glenn Simpson's role in trying to overturn the Magnitsky Act. And the other person invited, one of the other people invited, was Glenn Simpson. And as the days approached the testimony, he refused to show up. He refused to show up, and at the very last minute, they subpoenaed him. And then he and his lawyers went into big negotiations and then agreed to do it privately. But, I mean, if he's so worried about having all this stuff out in the public, why was he so worried about showing up in an open testimony as I did? It makes no sense.
Really interesting to get your initial reaction to that piece today. We're very thankful you came on with us tonight. Thank you for being here.